We're joined today by Dan Zahavi and Tony Steinbock, who will first have a conversation about the book and broader themes before we take questions from you all in the audience using the Q&A function, not the chat function. Since Dan Zahavi and Tony Steinbock hardly need an introduction, just allow me to note that Zahavi is a professor of philosophy and the director of the Center for Subjectivity Research at the University of Copenhagen. Since 2018, he has also had a secondary appointment as professor of philosophy at the University of Oxford. He is also co-editor-in-chief of Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences, and the author of a number of books and many more articles in phenomenology, philosophy of mind, and cognitive science, and a widely recognized leading figure in all these areas. Most notably, the third edition of The Phenomenological Mind, which Dan co-authored with Sean Gallagher, will be released in just a few weeks. Anthony Steinbock is a professor of philosophy at Stony Brook University. He's the editor-in-chief of Transcendental Philosophy Review, and he's also the series editor of Northwestern's Studies in Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy series. He's also the author of a number of celebrated and widely read books in phenomenology and philosophical anthropology. Perhaps most notably, and I think this is the first time the book is being announced, Steinbock is the author of a new book, Knowing by Heart, Loving as Participation and Critique, that will be published by Northwestern next fall. So with that, I welcome Dan and Tony. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Tara. Thanks. Dan, I'm delighted to speak with you about the reedition of your book, and I have central themes, some central themes that I'd like we can to address and discuss. First of all, I want to note that the work is so important because it addresses fundamental dimensions of our experience, most centrally self-awareness, and it would be difficult for us to proceed philosophically and phenomenologically without a clarification of these central ideas. You present a systematic account of Husserl's theory of self-awareness. That's important not just for Husserl, but for philosophy in general. You contribute to the discussion of self-awareness, alterity, give a unique account of subjectivity, and the appearance of objects and the condition for the possibility of manifestation. So your book has had influence in continental philosophy and phenomenology in particular, the philosophy of mind, and psychopathology and developmental psychology. So before we go into specific themes of the book, I'm wondering if you could give us an account of the genesis of this central book, early book for yourself that's been developed in certain ways, but for us in phenomenology.
Yeah, no, of course. So I think perhaps the starting point is to consider the trajectory of my thinking, and I think I kind of view a strong continuity between the different themes that I have been working on ever since my dissertation, and I think the dissertation in particular is actually fairly relevant for also understanding why I then made the move to the topics that I discuss in self-awareness and alterity. So my dissertation, which was completed in 1994 and which was published under the title Husserl und die transzendentale Intersubjektivität, or Husserl and Transcendental Intersubjectivity, was basically an attempt to offer a new interpretation of Husserl's theory of intersubjectivity. I basically argued that one of the main motives for Husserl's preoccupation with the problem of intersubjectivity was his interest in the problem of objectivity, and I was basically making the claim that for Husserl we need intersubjectivity, we need transcendental intersubjectivity if we are to address the problem of objectivity and reality. So this was basically, one of the main goals of the thesis, and then as a kind of secondary goal of the dissertation was to try to make the case that phenomenological explorations of intersubjectivity could withstand some of the criticisms that had come from critical theory, in particular Habermas. Now, when focusing on that criticism, I mean, some of the critical theorists had basically argued that, you know, if you have subjectivity as your starting point, you will never be able to make it to intersubjectivity. And so Habermas, at some point at least, favored a kind of more Wittgensteinian account where a community or language games is somehow the starting point. And my opposite claim was that subjectivity, rather than being an obstacle to intersubjectivity, was a necessary precondition for a proper conception of intersubjectivity, the relationship between subjects. Now, in exploring these themes, I came across, and this is still in the dissertation, I mean, I came across some reflections that Husserl had in Crisis, where he basically makes the case that there is a certain analogy between the depresentation or Entgegenwärtigung that you find in temporalization and the kind of self-alienation that we encounter in empathy. So Husserl seemed to be suggesting that there is some kind of link between the kind of fragmentation or self-distanciation that we find in our temporal life and our capacity to engage with and understand others. And I then wrote back then that one way to understand Husserl would be to say that there is a certain intra-subjective alterity that makes intersubjective alterity possible. And again, you know, another way of phrasing that is because I'm always already an other to myself in virtue of my temporal structure, that I can also experience the other. And I mean, that way of thinking is definitely very prevalent in the work of Merleau-Ponty as well, whom I also quoted in the dissertation. And there's a central passage in one of the chapters of Phenomenology of Perception, the chapter called Others and the Human World, where Merleau-Ponty basically quotes Husserl and then says that one of the decisive questions is to understand, and now I'm quoting, how the presence to myself that defines me and then conditions every external presence is simultaneously a depresentation and throws me outside of myself. And I mean, that specific quote then became the epigraph to self-awareness and alterity. So one might say that by, you know, exploring the role of intersubjectivity and by starting to look at the question of how subjectivity might be enabled by certain internal fractures or certain internal types of alterity. I mean, by doing that in the dissertation, I was kind of starting to consider more carefully, well, what could then be the relationship between basically self-awareness and alterity. And when I then completed the dissertation, as I said, in 1994, it was then very natural for me to apply for more money. That's what we are constantly doing. But I mean, in Denmark, we have this system like in Germany that you can write a second doctoral dissertation, a so-called habilitation. And so this is what I applied for money for, and that's basically what self-awareness and alterity was supposed to be. And perhaps just one word more about the genesis, because I also think that is kind of important. The very beginning of the work on self-awareness and alterity was work I did in Paris. I had until then been studying in Wuppertal in Germany with Klaus Held, and then with Rudolf Bernett in Leuven at the Husserl Archives in Leuven. And I had primarily been working on German phenomenology. I had done some work on Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, but my main focus was on German phenomenology. And I then thought, well, it would be very natural to kind of expand the scope and become more familiar with French phenomenology. And so I decided to go to Paris where I worked with Nathalie Deprat and her group around the journal Alter. And again, I mean, if one compares, self-awareness and alterity with the earlier work, I mean, one will see that there's a much stronger presence of figures like Michel Henry, Levinas, and Derrida, for instance. I mean, that I think has partly to do with the time I spent in Paris.
Oh, great. Okay. You were ending. I would like to pick up on the theme of alterity. Yeah, I remember reading this so many years ago. I was struck that the chapter on alterity came at the very end. Of course, it's throughout the work. And I'm assuming it wasn't because it's an afterthought, but there is a systematic reason for that. And you distinguish there at least three types of alterity: the alterity of the world, myself as another, and then the other in a very radical sense, like almost in a Levinasian sense. I'm just curious: is there a reason why that came at the end? Is it something that you wanted to develop later? And then that's just an incidental question. But then, what kinds of alterity are essential for self-awareness? And are there, you just differentiate those? Have you given other thought to other kinds of alterity? You know, like the icon or an art object, or you know, well, we can just begin with that, I guess.
Well, I think the final chapter that you were referring to, I think, should basically be seen as a kind of way of summarizing the preceding work. So it's of course not because alterity only enters the stage there. And I think it was precisely also important for me, and I mean there's a certain discussion of Levinas in that final chapter, and I think one can see my attempt at distinguishing those three types of alterity also to a certain extent as a way of distancing myself a bit from Levinas's insistence that the only true alterity is the alterity of the other, whereas I mean at least in Totality and Infinity, I mean, he makes the case that the so-called alterity of the world and the so-called alterity of the other is all something that to some extent can be controlled and mastered by the subject. And what I was trying to show was, well, I mean, the mastering subject, if you will, is precisely also enabled by an alterity internal to that subject. So it's not really as if the alterity is something that is under the subject's control. It's rather one of the enabling conditions. And then one might say, well, but I mean, how should that argument run? And I think a very important aspect of that argumentation, of course, has to do with inner time consciousness. And so it's also, I mean, I think it's perfectly kind of appropriate that I think one of the most important chapters in the book is precisely an attempt to offer a new interpretation of Husserl's theory of inner time consciousness, because the basic claim that I'm making is that contrary to some interpretations that has often presented Husserl as somebody who were completely preoccupied with object intentionality and for whom consciousness is always kind of related to an object. Contrary to those interpretations, it's very clear precisely in Husserl's discussion of inner time consciousness that he is here trying to unearth a different dimension of consciousness that is precisely not characterized by a relationship to objects, that is not objectifying, and that Husserl's most kind of advanced and sophisticated account of self-awareness is precisely to be found in his discussion of temporality. And again, I mean, if we talk about temporality, then we have to talk about retention, protension, and the whole point, of course, is that the moment we start doing that, it's clear that we're not any longer dealing with a subject exclusively characterized by a kind of full self-presence. Rather, there is a kind of temporal absence in the very heart of subjectivity.
So would you say that that given that alterity is constitutive of subjectivity, are they constitutive? Are different kinds of alterities constitutive of subjectivities in different ways? For example, as a perceptual subject or an ethical subject or a religious subject, for example. Would you say that, or maybe you're not working that dimension, then you will, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I mean, of course, I mean, I have not done the same amount of work, for instance, on the religious dimension as you have, and so it's not really a natural part of my way of thinking, I have to confess. But I would agree with you. I mean, that I think alterity is to be found in different places, so to speak, and it plays a different role depending on what we are talking about. And I think that an obvious place to return to is precisely the distinction that you called attention to a moment ago. I mean, the distinction between three types of alterity, because one type, the kind of type internal to oneself, I mean, the most natural place to locate that, of course, is in inner time consciousness. And it could also, for instance, be found in the very relationship between reflecting and reflected consciousness. I mean, Husserl even speaks sometimes of a ego splitting as a result of reflection. But then there is the alterity of the world, and I think one very important, again, claim in my book was that self-affection and hetero-affection, or self-manifestation and hetero-manifestation, always go hand in hand, and that one cannot say first there is one and then the other. And so, and I mean that kind of, to give alterity a role there is a different role than it has when we are, for instance, considering the primary impression, retention, protension structure. So I think, I mean, I would agree with you. I mean, alterity is not just one thing. It's a variety of different aspects, and it plays different roles depending on what dimensions of subjectivity we are investigating. So, intentional subjectivity is also dealing with a form of alterity, and it's a different type than the one that has to do with, say, time consciousness.
I just want to add, this is more of a side question. I was wondering, and if it's not so relevant, we'll just pass. But I was wondering, in the phenomenon of double sensations or touching touched, is there a form of alterity for you? Is there a form of alterity in that experience, or is it reducible? There's all sorts of debates about that.
Sure. But yeah, no, I mean, I would very much view that also as a form of alterity, and I mean, I'm really trying to make the case in the book and also later on that that bodily exteriority and my encounter with bodily exteriority, and the fact that my self-experience has that exteriority to it, is actually very important if we are to make sense out of interpersonal understanding. And I think, again, I think this is a very Merleau-Pontian line. So the idea of somehow reducing double sensation to a kind of internal immanent spiel, I mean, doesn't appeal to me at all.
Okay, so let me pass now from alterity to the question of self-awareness. So I understand correctly, you want to ask in some ways how consciousness is aware of itself, how it experiences itself, how it's given to itself. So maybe there is there are two things at issue here, that there is self-awareness and the kind of self-awareness it is. And so maybe, I don't know if you agree with that, and can you elaborate?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, So I think I mean one way to approach your question would be by saying, you know, and I apologize for perhaps having this tendency always of doing this. We need to make distinctions, and so self-awareness is also something that is not univocal, because there are different types of self-awareness. And I think one of the major accomplishments of phenomenology has precisely been to say that self-awareness is not just a question of reflection, even if that might be the most, you know, the most garden type variety of self-consciousness. No, there is also a pre-reflective self-awareness. Actually, even that distinction is not sufficient, because if we start talking about reflective self-awareness, I mean, then one can, within the phenomenological literature, I mean, find a whole variety of further distinctions, you know, so, you know, personalizing self-awareness, or naturalizing self-awareness, or, you know, pure or transcendental self-reflection. I mean, there are all kinds of further distinctions to be made. But I mean, let me, if that's fine with you, I mean, let me perhaps also use that question as an occasion to just briefly remind also our audience about what is actually the structure of the book. We have already addressed it a little bit, but it's perhaps also worthwhile saying something about the first part of the book, because the book has two parts. The second part is all about phenomenology, but that's not where we start, so to speak. In the first part, I actually have a discussion a discussion of analytic philosophy of language and mind, dealing with the specificities or peculiarities of first personal self-reference. To put it differently, I mean, why is it that the first person pronoun I refer in a very different way, say, than definite descriptions? This is what I'm focusing on in the first chapter. And then in the second chapter, I'm engaging with the work of the so-called Heidelberg School, which it was a very influential school oriented around the work of Dieter Henrich in Heidelberg, who basically, by drawing on insights from German idealism and also to some extent from analytic philosophy, were trying to come up with an account of self-consciousness. And so by discussing both of these different traditions, both of which are different from phenomenology, part of the ambition was to perhaps to get clearer about what is the problem of self-consciousness actually, and what challenges do we face when we want to try to explain self-consciousness. But of course, there was also a kind of dialectical move in this way of setting the stage, because my discussion of both of these other traditions also ended in a certain criticism, in the sense that I was basically arguing there are some issues here that are not sufficiently addressed. And then I made the move to phenomenology, trying to say or argue that some of the problems that I had found with the other approaches might perhaps be resolved by phenomenology. And I mean, it is kind of important for me to emphasize this structure, because one of the reasons for doing that was of course also to show that phenomenology has resources to address questions that are being discussed in other philosophical traditions. And I think that is what we should be aware of that, and we should highlight that, because we can get so much out of that kind of inter-traditional kind of conversation.
Yeah, actually, I had an earlier question. Let me just ask you now, if, I mean, I don't think it'll take us far afield. It's actually on this point. I mentioned three different areas that your work has made a contribution, continues to make contributions to, in phenomenology and what we call, perhaps maybe misleadingly, continental philosophy, philosophy of mind, and also developmental psychology, psychopathology. What, if you can say that, you know, succinctly, what do you think your contributions of this book in particular, but also to what you're working on, what would you say? Let's keep it focused on self-awareness and alterity. What do you think the contributions are to each of those areas? Because I think in phenomenology we're you just were saying attentive to certain things, and it pushes, you know, us in a particular direction. But in the philosophy of mind, you know, your work is well received, and also you are in a dialogue with people in cognitive psychology and cognitive science as well. So what do you think your contributions of that work is for those different areas?
So we should focus on, I mean, on the one hand, philosophy of mind, and on the other, kind of empirical science. Or would you also want me to say something about continental philosophy more broadly?
Maybe that's probably, I think that's probably more evident, but let's say if you're working in psychopathology, you know, or developmental psychology.
No, of course. Yeah, okay, but let's take perhaps philosophy of mind first. So I think this is actually also something that I'm commenting on in the new kind of preface to the second edition, that reading the book again was a little bit scary. And why is that? Well, because it just dawned on me how many of the topics that I have been working on since then, that was actually that was already launched in self-awareness and alterity. I mean, I guess we all like to see ourselves as people whose thinking keeps developing in new, unexpected directions. I mean, I hope mine has done that to some extent, but there's certainly also a lot that has kind of remained the same. And some of the things that I was kind of talking about in self-awareness and alterity that I think has been picked up in philosophy of mind is primarily two things. One is the notion of a minimal self or an experiential self. So this is something that comes up in one of the chapters where I'm trying to distinguish different ecological levels. And I can say a little bit more about that later on, perhaps. I mean, but the minimal self on the one hand, and on the other, I mean, the very notion of pre-reflective self-awareness, because I think that has happened. I mean, there has undoubtedly been a huge shift in the way self-consciousness and also selfhood is being discussed in philosophy of mind. And I think that, I mean, not that I want to claim that that it's just my responsibility. I mean, I don't want to say that at all, but I just think it's a matter of fact that pre-reflective self-awareness is so much more one of the kind of, one of the kind of leading contenders for a notion of self-awareness these days than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And similarly, when it comes to this notion of a minimal self, or the idea that, you know, the very subjectivity of experience already amounts to a certain form of selfhood, it's also something that has been picked up. Of course, people have also criticized it. I mean, that kind of is part of the game, but it's just much more part of the conversation today than it was, again, 20 or 30 years ago. So that's, I think, philosophy of mind. And I mean, and also perhaps I should say that I think one of the reasons why there has been this, convergence, I mean, probably also has to do with developments internal to philosophy of mind, where I really think one of the main changes was that it became increasingly acceptable to really focus on experience. I mean, so if we wanted to deal with consciousness, it was not satisfactorily just to look at, say, consciousness, along a computer, software, hardware analogy or something like that. I mean, people increasingly recognize if we want to address consciousness seriously, we also need to take the first person perspective seriously. And the moment they that dawned on analytic philosophers, I think they became increasingly open to the idea that there could actually be important resources to be found in phenomenology. When it then comes to developmental psychology and psychopathology, which is the kind of, I guess, two empirical disciplines that I have been working on most since then, I think it's also, I mean, it's kind of interesting that there are actually brief discussions of both already in self-awareness and alterity, which is very different from, my dissertation. I mean, the dissertation was exclusively philosophical, but I think two things happened, and which is perhaps also of interest, to the audience. Two things happened in between the dissertation and the conclusion of the self-awareness and alterity manuscript that really has been very decisive for my thinking since then. One was and to some extent, two of them were both of them were kind of coincidences. So on the one hand, I stumbled across a book by the developmental psychologist Daniel Stern, a book called The Interpersonal World of the Infant, where Stern, who is a developmental psychologist, or who was a developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst, basically were interested in self-experience and forms of intersubjectivity, basically in the first year of life. And when I read that, I was just stunned, because there were so many, many of his observations concerning, the role of embodiment, concerning the role of really pre-linguistic forms of self-experience and interpersonal contact, that matched with what I had kind of tried to develop from a more phenomenological point of view. But here suddenly there were empirical evidence supporting, these kinds of claims. And then, of course, what I realized then was that, well, the topics that I'm working on, intersubjectivity and self, are of course not topics exclusively of philosophical interest. I mean, these are topics that are very much debated and drawn upon in a variety of different disciplines. And by engaging with those disciplines, I can both, as a philosopher, make a contribution, which I have to say is extremely rewarding, because suddenly you realize, wow, I mean, some of these ideas I've had, they actually mean something to other non-philosophers. I mean, I'm really sincerely, when I say that was a very huge discovery for me. But of course, the influence also goes the other way, in the sense that these, say, developmental psychologists, are of course paying attention to a lot of aspects that I had never been concerned with or even realized were kind of important. So it has been, I think, very much an important development or kind of exchange. And I have, over the years since then, been publishing articles with developmental psychologists focusing on, for instance, mirror self-recognition, which I also very briefly touch upon in Self-Awareness and Alterity. And so mirror self-recognition is incidentally also something that, say, Merleau-Ponty was writing on. It's basically this question of, what is it that happens when the child suddenly realizes that the specular image is, the child's own image. I mean, what happens then? And in developmental psychology, there has been a very widespread kind of paradigm called the mirror mark test, where you and I'm sure many of you will know about this. I mean, where you mark the forehead of the child with a red dot, and then you observe what happens when the child then confronts the mirror. And I mean, up to a certain age, the child will be very happy about seeing this perfect playmate over there, which always comes. He always shows up whenever the child is there. I mean, fantastic type of friend. But then at some point, the child will also point towards the red dot in the forehead of the mirror image. But then at some point, and this is roughly around 18 to 24 months, the child would suddenly start to touch its own forehead. And that has been interpreted by a number of developmental psychologists as a kind of decisive litmus test for the presence of self-awareness. And in the article that I wrote with this developmental psychologist, we have written other things together, but this was one of the articles, a developmental psychologist from Emory called Philippe Rochat. We basically criticized the assumption that there's only self-awareness from the moment the child recognizes himself in the mirror, and basically we were basically, I guess, making two points. One was that that recognizing one's own mirror image is actually a quite complicated task, because what you are confronted with in the mirror is basically it's the view on your own body from the outside that you have never seen before. I mean, this is how you appear to others. It's not how you normally experience your own embodiment. And to suddenly come to recognize or realize that exteriority is yourself, I mean, it's quite an achievement, and it's perhaps not one. I mean, it's not so strange that many children initially react with trepidation. Sorry, what is the English word here? Trepidation.
Trepidation, yes.
Trepidation, yeah. So they can be a bit scared about this because this is very alienating somehow to be confronted with that. So on the one hand, it's actually quite complicated, and on the other hand, and this is of course where phenomenology would would come in. I mean, how should the infant be able to recognize that what it sees is its own mirror image unless it's able somehow to detect that there is a certain synchrony between its own movements and the movements of the specular image? And in order for that synchrony to be meaningful, I mean, the child has to know or has to feel that the movement it makes itself is exactly its own movements. I mean, if the child didn't feel its own body as part of itself, if it didn't have some kind of, implicit bodily self-awareness, I mean, I don't think it could ever pass any mirror self-recognition task. So again, mirror self-recognition really seems to presuppose more fundamental forms of self-awareness that the kind of mainstream developmental psychologists have seemingly kind of overlooked. Okay, so I mean, I can say much more about that. I won't do that now because we should say a little bit about psychopathology as well, or you want to interrupt?
Let me just follow up on this other, but just in case there's any confusion with the listeners. What you describe in terms of self-awareness is also, there are many distinctions perhaps within that. Well, there are. So I wonder if you could say, or at least elucidate, the relationship between the different kinds of self-awareness, like self-manifestation, self-affection, because the kind of self-awareness you were just referring to in that mirror example is not the kind of self-awareness that you're trying to elucidate.
Of course.
And is that, so just to be clear in terms of the terminology of your work, is that deeper sense or more primordial sense you would want to call self-manifestation?
Yeah,
or,
I mean, well, I mean,
not.
I think, I think you are to some extent pointing your finger at a somewhat sore point because on the one hand, it's easy to answer your question in the sense that yes, self-manifestation is supposed to be the most fundamental form of self-awareness, and I would normally never talk about self-manifestation, in terms of mirror self recognition. So that is fine. However, one of the things that I was trying to do in the book Self-Awareness and Alterity was to somehow operate with a distinction between self-awareness and self-consciousness, which I subsequently have actually given up because I thought that so I think my basic and I think some attentive readers have definitely caught on to that I tend in the book primarily to talk about self-awareness when talking about pre-reflective, non-objectifying self-awareness, and primarily to talk about self-consciousness when talking about a more intentional form of self-consciousness, a more reflective form. But the problem with that distinction between self-awareness and self-consciousness is that there's absolutely no consensus in the literature at large about using the terms in that specific way. I mean, some people actually use them in exactly the opposite way. And so at some point I say, okay, this is just too confusing. And I've had a kind of footnote that I really repeated many times, where I typically at the beginning of a book or an article basically says, in the following, I'm going to use self-awareness and self-consciousness synonymously.
But you're also trying to elucidate this primordial sense, let's say, of self-awareness as, well, that's the structured through, if you want to put it, alterity, perhaps. But the question I had, what, how does this kind of self-awareness appear to us? Or we could add, what are its modes of givenness, or what can we look for? Or, you know, what is it that we experience in this self-manifestation? Some examples of that.
Yeah. Well, so I guess one of the central claims of mine, which is also kind of what I've been pursuing later on as well, is basically this claim that phenomenal consciousness, to use a term from philosophy of mind, I mean, basically, you know, experiences that experiences are already characterized by a kind of an intrinsic self-awareness. So so it's wrong-headed to assume that when we have an experience, say an intentional experience of a bottle, well, then we are exclusively, if you will, bottle directed, as if there's a total self-forgetfulness or absolutely no manifestation of subjectivity along as well. So I mean, my claim has, on the contrary, been, well, if we are to understand heteromanifestation, that is the manifestation, say, of an external object like a bottle, if we are to understand its disclosure or its manifestation, we need to understand that can only happen if it's accompanied by a self-manifestation at the same time. So when I am intentionally directed at a bottle, that's not merely bottleness, so to speak, there's also a first personal givenness of the perception through which that bottle is disclosed. I mean, that's in nutshell the basic claim that I'm making.
Is that a presupposition or a precondition, or is it experienced somehow?
Well, is it experience? I mean, I guess one way to yeah, no, that was a good question, but I do think it's experience, because I think this is what makes experience experiential, if you will. So perhaps the relevant question would be to ask, how should we understand, you know, a form of intentional directedness that was not accompanied by this kind of intrinsic self-awareness? And I think that the standard case of that, which a number of analytic philosophers would defend, would basically be a form of non-conscious information processing. I mean, so here's another way to put it. What is the difference between a non-conscious perception of a bottle and a conscious perception of the bottle? And on my account, well, the difference is precisely that the conscious perception of the bottle doesn't merely give me the bottle, because that also is what happens in the non-conscious perception of the bottle. That is also bottle directed, if you will. You know, the difference is precisely that it shows up for me. I mean, and it's precisely this for me-ness of the experience that, in my view, makes it appropriate to talk of self-awareness, and also is the reason why we are talking about an experiential phenomenon and not merely a kind of Kantian transcendental precondition that we simply have to assume if we are to make sense out of whatever we encounter in the world. So I would very much want to insist that this is an experiential element. And of course, I mean, some people would say, or I have heard this line of criticism before, like, well, I don't have it like that, or I mean, I can't find that kind of self-awareness that you're talking about. And I think in my view, I mean, perhaps they are looking for the wrong thing, so to speak, because I do think that what they have when they are, observing a bottle, I mean, there is not just bottleness there's also a givenness of the bottle, and the fact that there is a givenness of the bottle means that there is subjective experience as well, and that is not just a precondition. No, this is part of what makes the experience into the conscious experience it is. Anyway.
Okay, that's good. I have another question in relationship to that, but before I ask that, when you mentioned, just to clarify, heteromanifestation, do you mean by that the givenness of something other, or myself alienating or self, what you call alterating?
No, I mean the first.
Okay.
But of course, I mean, that does not rule out that there might be ways for me to appear to myself that is also alienating or
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, you know, I think Husserl offers a lot of examples, as does Sartre. I mean, you know, to just take one of Sartre's example, which I think has always, I think, been found a fascinating example. I mean, Sartre has at one place this discussion of how pain appears, and where he says, you know, at first, if I have a headache or eye strain, I think it's eye strain, which shows up when I'm reading late at night. I mean, the way the pain shows up is by making the text kind of, it's a bit as if the words are jumbling on the page. And then subsequently, I mean, I might be able to kind of scrutinize and thematize the specific, you know, I mean, then I might be able to scrutinize specific H's, IHs, I know, can you say that in English? I mean, specific pains in the eyes. And this might then give rise to me talking about one and the same pain that then manifests itself across time. And eventually I might even, you know, visit a doctor and be told that I'm suffering from a specific eye disease. And the moment I then start to think about the pain in my eyes as manifestation of a specific eye disease, I mean, there's always so much, you know, added material to the self-awareness that this is, in a lot of ways, a very kind of alienating or mediated form of self-awareness, because I'm suddenly experiencing myself and thinking about myself in ways that are precisely mediated through language, through interpersonal contact, etc., etc. So I think arguably that could be designated as a form of heteromanifestation, but normally I'm using it to really talk about the manifestation of that which is different from the subject.
Yeah, I'm just watching. We have probably a few more minutes before we can open up for the question and answer. But I would like to follow up. There are actually several questions, and maybe we can talk about. Will come up in the discussion. But I wanted to follow up something that you mentioned in chapter 8, the mindness that becomes more of a central issue in subjectivity and selfhood, and then self and other. So mindness, as I understand it, is the fact that these experiences are have a first personal givenness that immediately reveals these experiences as mine. Is that correct?
I mean,
or
yes and no. I mean, I
minimal,
think sorry.
No,
well,
it's a minimal sense of self. The question I have is, does this mindness come in degrees, or is it all or nothing? And how does that relate then to this pre-reflexive self-awareness or this self-manifestation?
So I certainly think both are very intimately related, but I think the question about whether they come in degrees, I think the best way of responding to that is actually by returning to a topic that I promised to say something about, which I kind of didn't, namely the issue of psychopathology, because it has precisely been that notion that has then been picked up by a number of psychiatrists working in phenomenological psychiatry and beyond, because a general claim made by a number of leading figures here is that schizophrenia in particular can be seen as a form of self disorder. Some of the very early German psychiatrists were talking about schizophrenia as a form of Ich-Störung, kind of self-disorder. And the interesting question is, well, what kind of self is it that somehow is at stake here, or that is somehow challenged or disturbed? I'm reminded of something that Minkowski at one point he makes the following kind of comparison in the book The Lived Time that was recently republished by Northwestern, where he says let's compare a patient with schizophrenia with a patient with dementia. And if we confront a patient with dementia, I mean, the person might say, the person might not any longer remember, what year it is, what profession he or she had, or even her or his own name. But the person is very well aware that it's here and now. And for me, that this confusion is kind of occurring. Now, the patient with schizophrenia is basically again, this is of course a bit simplified, but one might perhaps say that it's the opposite problem. So the patient with schizophrenia might very well know that he or she is living, in 2020 in Denmark, has this kind of profession, but what is really puzzling and enigmatic is who am I, or what does it mean that something is here and now? So I think this shows that I think it makes perfect sense to say that both of these disorders somehow affect the self. I mean, the person with dementia, there's of course also a certain destruction of narrative self or extended self, because you can no longer kind of keep track of your past in a kind of meaningful way. But I think it's very clear that the problem that the patient with dementia is confronted with is utterly unlike the problem that the person with schizophrenia is confronted with. And so the phenomenological psychiatrists have then said, well, it seems as if it's the minimal self, or the notion of for-me-ness or mine-ness, that is somehow not working normally in the case of schizophrenia. And then there has been an ongoing discussion, and actually I wrote an article together with some colleagues that came out last year, I think, where we actually went back to this question about how exactly should we understand the kind of damage or disturbance that occurs to the minimal self or the mindness in schizophrenia, because there is a clear tension here. Either you claim that mindness or for-me-ness is so central and intrinsic a feature of conscious experience that conscious experience cannot be conscious experience if it's absent. I mean, this is one claim you can make, which I have made. But if you say that, well, then it's also to some extent a little bit strange to say that patients with schizophrenia have problems with this very, very fundamental feature, because we don't want to say that they don't have experiences. So what exactly is the claim then? I mean, do they or don't they have a minimal self or a sense of for-me-ness? And the kind of result we kind of opted for was to say that, well, this feature or dimension of experience is not absent, but it is to some extent weakened or threatened in certain ways in schizophrenia. And for instance, one thing that seems to be a huge problem is that in normal life, we can very easily go from having an experience and being pre-reflectively aware of it as our own, to reflectively articulating it as our own. I mean, it doesn't seem to present any problem whatsoever. I mean, I have a perception of this what's it called, screen, and then I can say I am having a experience of the screen. I mean, no, what's the issue? That's very, very easy for me to make this transition. But it seems as if that is actually a huge problem for patients with schizophrenia. I mean, there is not this kind of very natural transition to a kind of a more elaborate, articulated first-person judgment that he or she is having a certain experience. And that seems to be the reason why there seems to be this impairment, has to do somehow with the very structure of that mindness in the first place. So so to come back to your question, can it be graded? And I think that is precisely what we were then saying. We need actually more distinctions. It might be that there's a certain core of the minimal self that must be there, otherwise we do not have conscious experiences. But perhaps there are some features that we normally enjoy that can actually be disturbed or fractured or damaged in certain forms of mental illness.
Let me just ask one more question before we open it up. To what extent, or if it can the sense of mindness be shared?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and it actually links up with work that I'm doing right now. Because I mean, I didn't really say much about my current work, but but briefly, I mean, while working first on intersubjectivity and then the self, and then having spent a lot of time on kind of empathy. About 5 years ago, or a bit longer ago, I basically made the move to discuss collective intentionality and community and we intentionality. And I think one of the absolutely crucial questions here is, how should one understand the we? So is the we a kind of expanded I? I mean, so when you're saying can the mindness be shared? I mean, the question, of course, is, well, what exactly is that supposed to mean? Is it supposed to mean that, say, two streams of consciousness can somehow participate in one and the same mindness? And I think that the right way to address that problem is by saying that that a we experience is not just I'm having an experience plus you are having an experience, but nor is it simply saying I large are having an experience. I think it really is I mean, we really need to have the plural preserved. I mean, I think this is also, why it's so important to understand that the we is a first person plural. So there has to be a plurality, there has to be a difference. But of course, we can have experiences that we then experience as ours. So I think the relevant point here is not actually mindness, it's ourness, if I can say so in English.
Yeah, which is actually one of the insights Husserl, going back to Husserl, has in his later work. Okay. Thank you, Dan, very much. We can continue this then. Trevor, I'll turn that back over to you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you both, Dan and Tony. So at this point, we will take questions from the audience. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A. I'm going to read the questions just to make things easier. So first, we have a somewhat long question from Zach Joachim. Zach writes, I have a specific question, Dan, about your discussion of Anscombe in the last section of the first chapter. I haven't yet gotten my hands on the new edition, but I was wondering whether you've since had further thoughts on how your view is really distinct from that of Anscombe's and of followers of Wittgenstein in general. Anscombe's view has become influential among certain contemporary readers of Kant and Hegel, who see in Anscombe a way of preserving the critical insight that the I is fundamentally distinct from an object and thus cannot be an object of reference. The view, moreover, seems quite compatible to your own view as expressed in a number of works in addition to the book, but quite strikingly, for example, in your article on Natorp and the early Heidegger. So basically, it seems to me, that is Zach, that you and Anscombe have no reason to disagree. I don't think it's correct to interpret her as advocating something like a no ownership view, as you suggest in the first edition of Self-Awareness and Alterity. I was wondering if you've thought more about this since 1999, basically, and also how you think this particular point of contact between analytic philosophy, phenomenology, and German idealism is now an additional fruitful one.
That was a very long question. So thanks, Zach. No, I think, I mean, to answer very briefly, I have not been doing any work on Anscombe since probably 1996. So I can't really say that my view has changed on that point. But I guess the way I read her back then as basically being a proponent of the claim that the reason why I mean, the first person pronoun I refers or it works so differently from other referential descriptions, referential expressions, is because it doesn't refer at all. I mean, again, if that interpretation stands, I mean, I think it's clear that my view would be utterly different. I mean, so I think in order in order to understand why you think that there should be a certain convergence between my view and hers, I think I would need to know more, and also more than is possible now, about why you think she should be read in a very different way than I think a lot of people would read her. So let me just, so I think that is all I can kind of say about Anscombe, and I didn't change anything in my treatment of her in the second edition. But there was also this question about whether ideas from German idealism might be kind of relevance for the current discussion. I don't know if you're thinking about the work of Sebastian Rödl, for instance. So there are, of course, I mean, people who are definitely working on and also trying, specifically to link, Hegel up with discussions in analytic philosophy. And I think these people are often called the analytic Hegelians, often located in Leipzig. But I think one thing that is interesting, or perhaps also missing in their account, is that there's very little engagement with phenomenology, to my knowledge, at least. So I'm sorry. I think that's about all I can say, at least for now.
Okay, I have another question. This is from an anonymous attendee. What is it that you, Professor Zahavi, would like readers now in 2020 to become acquainted or reacquainted with in this new edition of Self-Awareness and Alterity? So I guess I would say, what are you hoping that people will take away from?
Yeah, well, I mean, perhaps, just as a preamble to that question, I mean, perhaps I should just very briefly explain what the difference is between the two editions, because, I mean, also given Zach's question, I mean, perhaps some are sitting with the expectation that it's basically a completely new, utterly different book, and of course it is not. I mean, so let me just perhaps very briefly just highlight what is actually the differences. And very briefly put, there's a few places where I basically changed the text because I saw it was clearly mistaken. And I think the perhaps two most relevant places is, on the one hand, my discussion of psychopathology, where I know so much more about psychopathology now than I did back then, and I think I made certain claims about depersonalization that I don't think are correct. And then in the very end of the appendix, I had perhaps a slightly obscure discussion of somnambulism that also drew on quite old material. And when reading that through, I thought this is not really something that I am prepared to still withstand. So I think, so I made some changes, some more substantial changes in areas where I just basically disagree. Then I have added a number of references along the way, highlighting places where I later on have developed some of the themes discussed in Self-Awareness and Alterity more fully. And then I think there were primarily two major changes. One is stylistic changes, and I basically made changes on each and every page. So I mean, the text has really been worked through again. But I think the motivation for that was that when I wrote Self-Awareness and Alterity, it was my first book in English. And I think when reading it, 20 years later, it kind of was pretty evident to me that this was the first book. So I thought there was a lot of ways one could basically make the whole text flow better. So there was a lot of stylistic changes. And then finally, and I think I should kind of credit Galen Strawson for pushing me on this, the original version contained a lot of German and French quotes. And there was actually far more of them than I had initially thought. I mean, I think it made up, 20 to 30 pages of text. It is written out in normal Roman 12. And so all those quotes have been translated into English to really make it easier for people who don't master French and German to understand the texts that I was referring to. So these are basically the changes I made. So it is the same book. I mean, I had not, I mean, were I to rewrite it such that it reflected how I would address those questions today, I mean, I would have had to write a completely new book. I don't think it would have made sense to try to transform self-awareness and alterity in that way. But I have kind of tried to make it more readable. And then to come back to the question, you know, what is it that I want people to take away here? I think perhaps, I mean, again, we have already discussed a number of I think, important items in the book, but I think perhaps, I mean, at least one thing that perhaps hasn't been emphasized sufficiently is actually the Husserl interpretation that I'm offering, which I think is really a Husserl interpretation that shows Husserl to be very much anticipating ideas and you know, developments that normally are associated with, you know, post-Husserlian phenomenology. So I mean, many of the ideas in Merleau-Ponty, in Sartre, in Michel-Henry, I think I'm trying to show that such ideas can actually be found, worked out in a certain fashion in Husserl. And so I think that, I mean, if one reads the book, I think one will come across, or one will come away with a very different Husserl interpretation, you know, compared to what one might, you know, come away with if, say, one is reading the work of Dreyfus or Taylor Carmen, to just mention some very utterly different ways of reading Husserl.
Okay, thank you. Maybe related to that, I have a question from Matt W. Have you developed your interpretation of Husserl's notion of absolute consciousness beyond what you've said in the first edition, or do you think there's more to be said in light of recently published manuscripts?
Yeah, well, so thanks for that question, because there is actually one subsequent. I mean, I didn't really. Well, I might. Yes, I think I actually added a new footnote saying what I'm going to say now in the second edition. So I haven't really worked much. Well, yeah, no, let me just think. I guess there are two areas where I think I have done subsequent work on absolute consciousness. One is that self-awareness and alterity doesn't really contain any reference to the Bernauer manuscripts. They came out afterwards, and I have subsequently worked on those. But then perhaps more significantly, in self-awareness and alterity, in my discussion of inner time consciousness, I explicitly criticized a very influential interpretation by John Brough and Bob Sokolovsky. And we have had since then a kind of ongoing forth and back about who has gotten Husserl right. And there were then there was an issue of Husserl studies about 10 years ago that contained new articles by me and Brough on this issue, and where I think we were trying to somehow sketch out perhaps a way of reconciling our perspective. So I think I guess what I'm trying to say is the people who are interested in what I have to say on absolute time consciousness, I think perhaps that issue of Husserl studies is worth looking at, also to see what Brough is responding.
Next, I have a question from John Araldo, or it's a two-part question. What is the method or way to display or manifest the nature of pre-reflective or non-reflective self-awareness, or to disclose, for example, the structure of inner time consciousness? Does this method involve a kind of self-reflection that we must presume does not alter what we display and speak about? And part two of the question, would you consider forms of meditation practice as possible methods to discover and bring to light the nature of self-awareness and alterity?
Yeah, so these are certainly also excellent questions. They're also slightly difficult questions, because I think one of the obvious questions that any investigation of pre-reflective self-awareness has to face up to. And this is also something that I explicitly address in one of the concluding chapters of the book, is precisely this question of how can we articulate those structures. I mean, it's one thing to just live them through, which kind of happens more or less automatically, but that of course doesn't give us phenomenological insights into the nature of these structures. In order to obtain those insights, I mean, we somehow need to attend to the structures in one way or another. And of course, the obvious question is, by somehow turning the phenomenological gaze, to use that metaphor, to these structures, I mean, how can we avoid somehow altering them or transforming them in some way? And I have a somewhat, I think, extensive discussion of that specific problem, which of course to some extent is also a very classical objection to phenomenology per se, because, and it's also, I mean, it's actually also an objection that Husserl was responding to in Ideas 1, because critics already back then were raising similar worries. And I think that the basic, I'm not sure that I can really, do justice to the complexity of the question here, perhaps satisfy you, but I think perhaps one potential productive way here is to distinguish different types of reflection, and we already kind of touched upon that earlier in the conversation. So I do think that there are forms of reflection that are indeed, distorting, and of course, there might be ways of reflection where we are really incorporating a lot of, if you will, external theorizing upon the subject matter that we wish to investigate, and where, that can lead us astray in all kinds of ways. But of course, Husserl would also claim that part of the phenomenological method is precisely to try to let the phenomena speak, and not to, and try to avoid precisely, straitjacketing those phenomena on the basis of preconceived theories. And so I think that the important point here is to try to understand whether paying attention to something, which is also what reflection is supposed to do, whether the very fact of paying attention necessarily distorts something. It might change something, but I think that is a virtue, because if it didn't change anything, well, then we might just make do with the pre-reflective self-consciousness we had all along. So reflection has to change something, otherwise it has no cognitive value. And I think the relevant question is whether attending to something and thereby highlighting something, whether that is necessarily distorting. And again, without being able to do full justice to it here, both what we find, I think, in both Husserl and Merleau-Ponty is the idea that in the best of circumstances, it could be that reflection are actually able to kind of articulate structures and meaning that were already inherent in the stream of consciousness. So I think, I think that's kind of all I can say. And there was this issue about meditation and mindfulness, which is all, perhaps you didn't talk about mindfulness, but I've recently written an article on phenomenology and mindfulness. So it's actually also something that is on my mind right now. And I guess, so if the question is whether mindfulness might be, or whether meditation might be relevant for allowing for very meticulous descriptions, I think my reply would be yes. But I just want to add one thing, which is saying yes to that question is not at all saying yes to the question that phenomenology is a form of meditative practice. And I'm very, for a lot of reasons, I'm very much disagreeing with the latter claim, because I think phenomenology is a form of philosophizing, and there's much more to phenomenology than just offering precise descriptions of specific phenomena. And I think that extra part, which I think is very important, is kind of missed out or forgotten when one talks about phenomenology as somehow being a form of meditation.
Thanks, Ben. I have another question from Jeremy Smith. Wouldn't another example of quote, degrees of mindness or of I as fundamental non-objective self-experience be dreaming. When we are dreaming, the sense of mindness is somehow weaker than it is in waking life, and this is one of the essential distinctions between waking and dreaming, or I guess that's the question. And then there's an addendum that Jeremy Smith added. Might Michel Henry's notion of l'accroissement de soi, the somehow enhanced self-experience essential to works of mercy, but also the experience of beauty, be an example of a higher degree or level of self-experience as such? I hope I combine those questions correctly.
Okay.
Maybe first the dreaming, maybe.
I think actually I will pass on the second one because I'm not sure I'm so familiar with that part of Henri's work. So let me just focus on the first one. And I think absolutely, I think there are. I think there are degrees. Now I'm not sure that dreaming is always characterized by a much weaker sense of mindness, because imagine cases where you are having a nightmare and you are, for instance, having an experience of being pursued by somebody. Isn't that a very good example of an experience of feeling threatened, you yourself? So I'm not sure that all dreaming necessarily is lesser. But I think there's another way of perhaps also, and perhaps I should have mentioned that earlier. There's another way of highlighting why mindness can come in different degrees. So just consider just the following three examples. Being ridiculed and feeling ashamed as a result. Being ridiculed by your peers because of something you have done and feeling ashamed as a result is one example. Second example, standing, trying to read a menu in a language that you hardly master, so you have to kind of concentrate. And finally, standing on a 10-meter what's it called? Diving board? No, not diving board. Is it called diving board? If you are in a pool and have to jump from. Yeah. Okay, so standing there and trying to convince yourself that you can't do it. So I think all those three cases, are fairly different in terms of the kind of phenomenal character and the way these experiences are self-involving. So I think is already a good indication that self-experience is not just one thing. There might actually be a number of different types. But I think my point is just that there's also a certain formal structure that I think is goes along all these that are kind of common to all these experiences, and that has to do with, to use Tony's phrase again, the very kind of formal self-manifestation of experience that I think holds both for the shame experience and the diving board experience, and standing there trying to read a certain text. So I think we have to acknowledge that there's variety in self-experience, but I think that view is compatible with also insisting that there might be certain fairly formal features that remain invariant.
Thanks. I have another question from Zuo Shuai, and the question is, do I have to be aware of your mindness to form a we intention with you? Furthermore, what is exactly the difference between intersubjectivity and we intentionality?
Good. Okay, so I think let me start with the last question first, because I think that's fairly easy to respond to, and it also kind of highlights what is currently a certain discussion among people working on these topics. So some people would want to say that whenever I'm having a kind of, whenever I have a social relation with others, there's already something that we have in common, and that justifies talking about a certain we intentionality being present. Now, I find that a very strange way of talking about a we, because in my view, a we is a very specific social formation. It's a very peculiar and special social formation. And I think that the amount of people with whom I constitute a we is much smaller than the amount of people with whom I have social relations and interactions. And so again, I think the standard example here is if I'm standing, face to face with somebody who happens to be my worst enemy, there might be a lot of forth and back going on between us. We might insult each other, repeatedly in the most, terrible way. So there's a lot of sociality here, but I don't think that in and of itself makes it appropriate to talk about us constituting a we. So I think that would be so I think intersubjectivity is basically kind of an umbrella term, and I think the we is a much more specific kind of intersubjective relation. And then there was the question of whether, in order to constitute a we, I need to grasp the mindness of the other. Well, I mean, I think that's a little bit a tricky question, because I think that, what does it mean to say that I grasp the mindness of another? I think that the proper way to interpret that would be in the following way. I grasp that there's a mindness to your experience when I grasp that there's something in you that evades my grasp. I mean, this is almost a kind of Levinasian idea here that I have a proper appreciation of you as another subject the moment I recognize that there's more to you than what is displayed and manifest to me. Now, if this is what it means to grasp the mindness of another, well, then the question could be, does that have to be salient in order for me to constitute a we perspective with that other? And I'm kind of wondering, I'm not sure actually, because I think in some cases, perhaps in some cases we can have, forms of joint action, where at least, this elusiveness of you is really not salient in any way. Perhaps it has to be tacit, but it certainly doesn't have to be salient. So, if I say are helping Tony, carry up a heavy, table to his attic, we are collaborating in a kind of joint action here, and I think it makes perfect sense to say that there is a form of we-intentionality here. I could not carry up the table on my own, neither could he. So there's really something going on here that is collaborative. But do I, in order to engage in that, the question is, what kind of experience of Tony do I have to have all along? And I'm sure at some point I will have had an experience of Tony as being elusive, but the question is whether that has to be the case all along. And again, it's kind of an interesting question. I think I need to think a little bit more about it, but at least I hope what I've said so far can illuminate, at least answer partly your question.
Thanks. We have a bunch more questions, probably only have time for one or two more, but I have a question from Patrick Eldridge that I guess was inspired by your discussion of dreaming, but since you've written a lot about intersubjectivity and empathy, it kind of seems like a good one. What do you make of the parallelism that Husserl makes between empathy and remembering? Is there something more than a merely formal parallel here?
Yeah, so I think that the way I interpreted that parallel, and I'm not absolutely sure that is what Husserl had in mind, but the way I interpreted was basically the following, and I think this is to some extent a fairly Merleau-Pontian way of reading Husserl. So Merleau-Ponty would put it like this: had I had a kind of totally comprehensive and self-sufficient type of self-experience, then I would never be able to experience other subjects, because nobody else could kind of be like that. That's the basic idea. So in order to allow for intersubjectivity, it's important to focus on certain types of self-experiences that, so to speak, make the difference between self and other less radical. And I think this is why Merleau-Ponty in particular is looking at bodily forms of self-experience, because bodily forms of self-experience, especially bodily forms of self-experience that targets the exteriority of the body, are of course types of experiences that resembles those I have when I encounter other embodied subjects. And likewise, when Husserl is talking about the analogy, I mean, in my way of interpreting it would be to say what Husserl is saying here is that in our temporal self-comprehension, I mean, there's also to some extent a confrontation with oneself as another when I'm kind of recalling, you know, my past experiences. There is a certain splitting, a certain detachment. And I think my way of understanding that would be to say, well, it's precisely the fact that subjectivity is also characterized by those kinds of distances and fractures that somehow makes it slightly less paradoxical to claim that one can also encounter other subjects. So I think this is how I would interpret him, whereas I must say the idea that there should be a very precise analogy between recollection and empathy I find more problematic, because I really don't think, I mean, remembering myself as another is completely different, I think, from recognizing another subject. I mean, it's not just myself as another. I mean, that would be a completely wrong-headed way, I think, of understanding the interpersonal encounter if I kind of thought of the other simply as a new version of myself. So I think there's a limit to how far one can kind of press the analogy.
Thanks, Dan. We have a lot more questions. Do you feel like you're ready for one more, or
I think I could take one more, but then I have to rush off.
Okay. Yeah. Right. I know. I have a very interesting question. It's a little bit long about interculturality. Madalena Guzan writes, can the concept of we intentionality and the relation between mindness and ourness be used also in order to think the idea of belonging and the problem of interculturality? Namely, could we think that in the fact of belonging somewhere to a certain language or to a certain region or people, what comes to the fore is a certain mindness pervaded by ourness. My language is never only mine, my land is not mine, but ours, and so on. Therefore, would this intertwining between the two be also a path for thinking interculturality?
Yeah, I mean, I think the proper way to address that question is again to highlight, I mean, this need for distinctions. So again, I mean, I think there's a way of talking about mindness where it's understood in a very formal sense. It has basically to do with the very first personal givenness of experience. And I'm a little bit reluctant to say that very formal structure is modified or changed radically as a result of enculturation, language use, and so forth. But there are, of course, other ways of thinking about myself, what matters to me, what makes my life meaningful, where, culture and sociality plays an obvious role, and where I could never have, I mean, that kind of self-comprehension or that kind of self perception, or I could never have the kind of norms and values that I take to be self-defining, were it not because of my position in a specific community. So I think if we are interested in those aspects, I mean, I think that cultural dimension is absolutely crucial. I mean, then we need to consider the home world. We need to understand, levels of normality. We need to think about tradition, and also, talking about, what is ours. Again, one could make a distinction here as well, as say, there's not just one form of we, many forms of we. One type of we is the face-to-face based we that is very ephemeral. It kind of disappears the moment people kind of leave that specific interaction. This is, of course, a very different type of we than, say, the we of a national community that might be transgenerational. So, it's a we that can survive the change of generations. There are certain rituals, norms, values that somehow bind me together with my ancestors that I still consider to belong to the same we as myself. So again, there's a lot of distinction here that needs to be kind of, I think, addressed. And I guess, just to throw out one suggestion, it could be that, different levels of selfhood and different levels of we-ness, that it might potentially be very fruitful to see to what extent one might link and correlate those.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dan, for fielding all of these questions that touched on multiple aspects of your work and then just phenomenology in general. We really appreciate you taking the time. And for everybody attending, with your email registration, you should have received a discount code to be able to order the book, the second edition of Self-Awareness and Alterity, at a discount. If you didn't get that, feel free to email me and I can email you a code. Keep your eyes peeled for Tony's new book next fall. And I guess thank you all very much for attending.
And let me also just thank all the people in the audience for having listened and for having posed all these challenging questions. And in particular, thank you, of course, also to Trevor and Tony for doing this with me and for me.
Pleasure. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.